Welcome to the final session of ITaP 5, focusing on intentional scaffolding. In this session, we'll be focusing on how and when to fade scaffolds. During the session, I'll be asking you to answer questions and reflect on some of the content. At times, I'll ask you to pause the video so that you can have a think about the questions that I'm posing. You can see here that we've reached the end of this ITaP, where we'll continue to practice and then reflect on the experience overall. Take a moment to remind yourself of the links to the ITT ECF on this slide and the next. On each slide, pause for a moment and consider how we've drawn these different statements, many of which link back to previous ITaPs, together in order to strengthen our practice. And here's the second set of statements. Here are the key questions for the session. We will begin by reflecting on the ITaP so far, before considering how and when to remove the scaffolds we've put in place for our students. So let's get into part one. Firstly, I'd like you to reflect on the ITaP so far. There's a space in the booklet under day 4 for you to record your responses. And remember, these will be useful for when you're completing the ROP later on today. So firstly, I'd like you to have a think about the scaffolds that you've used. How did you make use of the scaffold or scaffolds during the lessons you've taught this week? And what effect did they have? Pause the video and write down your response. Again, there's space in the booklet to answer this question as well. So during the planning or conversations that you had with your learning coach or class teacher, have you considered at all how and when to remove the scaffolds you have used? If yes, what advice were you given or what decisions have you made? And if not, what might you do on reflection? Pause the video and write down your answers in the booklet. Okay, let's move on to part 2. In this section, we'll think about why it's so important to remove scaffolds. And we'll start by reminding ourselves of what Tricky says about removing scaffolds. So pause the video and have a read through. Tricky emphasizes providing lots of scaffolds and support in the early stages of learning a new concept. This can make it difficult, though, to remove scaffolds later, as students might resist the push towards greater independence. It's a difficult balance to strike. So with that in mind, I'd like you to reflect on the impact of removing scaffolds too early and too late. Again, there's space for you to write your answer in the ITaP booklet. So start with, what are the potential pitfalls of removing scaffolds too soon? Pause the video and write your response. And now, can you reflect, please, on removing scaffolds too late? What potential pitfalls might arise as a result of removing scaffolds too late? Pause the video and write your response. You can check your response against some of the ideas that I'm going to put forward on this slide. In both cases, we do face potential pitfalls. If we remove scaffolds for students too soon, we lose that desirable difficulty that we were striving for before because the task becomes too difficult. This might lead to a decreased confidence in the students in the work that they're doing and their ability to achieve. And it might mean that they're demotivated and discouraged to try again. However, if we remove them too late, we might lose that desirable difficulty because we make the task too easy rather than too hard. Students then might become demotivated as there's little challenge and therefore little engagement. And students then become reliant on the scaffold to complete the task, meaning that they lack independence. While that's a difficult balance to strike, there are some ways that we can think about how we can ensure we are removing the scaffolds at the right time. We'll start by looking at the way the walkthrough breaks this process down. Here, you can see the 5 steps that they suggest that you take. Pause the video and have a look at what the walkthrough says about this process. Again, we can see that removing the scaffolding is an important element of the process. And the walkthrough provides a useful model for doing this. We have looked at I do, we do, you do in detail before. This provides an effective structure for removing scaffolding over an individual learning sequence. In the rest of the session, we'll consider how to apply the same principle across a series of lessons. Let's move on to part 3. At this point, we'll be focusing primarily on the final 2 practicable strategies for this ITaP. So let's remind ourselves of these to begin with. The third practicable strategy of this ITaP is to evaluate learner progress. So during or after the lesson, you should reflect on how successful the scaffolds were in supporting the targeted student or students. You should consider both the student's ability to access the task as well as the quality of their outcomes. You should use the reflective questions on the right-hand side of the AIM-TLP form as an opportunity to reflect on this. And here are some of the things that you might want to consider. Their emotional response to a task, e.g. are they disengaged or are they engaged? The written work that they've produced, their verbal responses, and the intentional monitoring lap that you complete during the lesson. And the final practicable strategy for this ITaP is to fade scaffolds over time. As a reminder, this is explicitly mentioned in the ITT ECF, which demonstrates its importance. So during the planning stages of the next lesson, you should consider whether you can partially or fully remove the scaffold for the student in order to enable the student's skill, confidence, and independence to develop. So to begin with, let's take a moment to reflect on this question. How can we know when to remove a scaffold? There's space for you to answer this in the ITaP booklet. When you're answering, I want you to think especially about the links that you can draw to previous ITaPs in this process. Pause the video and write your response. This step of the use of scaffolds draws heavily on the skills that you have developed in the previous ITaPs. This slide is taken from the Checking for Understanding ITaP. Pause the video so that you can read over the different steps that are mentioned in this ITaP. What's important here is that understanding how much the students have gained, what knowledge they've understood, or what skills they're able to demonstrate is really, really important for knowing when to remove or at least fade a scaffold. So checking for understanding is key here. Again, this slide is taken from a previous ITaP. This is from the questioning ITaP. Once again, take a moment to read what's on the slide. And really, when we're thinking about fading scaffolds, the first part of what Dylan Williams says here is most important for us, collecting evidence that you need to inform your teaching. This slide is taken from the Strategic Use of Assessment ITaP, so ITaP 4. Again, pause the video so that you can remind yourself. So this is closely related to checking for understanding in that this form of assessment enables you to see what all students have understood in a very quick way. And finally, we can use our intentional monitoring, which we covered in the strategic use of assessment ITaP, in order to gain a better understanding of what students are able to do and what they know, so that we can feel confident in when we should fade or remove scaffolds. It comes down to effective checking for understanding and formative assessment. Take a moment to read the information on the slide. So here, Christodoulou summarizes the purpose of this kind of assessment. Crucially, she makes the point that it does not matter if you give one student more support than another for a particular task or assessment. The whole point is, to use her words, creating a consequence for you and the student. And that means informing both of you of what you need to do next for the student to improve. This is at the heart of intentional scaffolding, as we anticipate which students may require additional scaffolding so that we are ready to respond if and when they need it. Fletcher Wood agrees with Christodoulou in suggesting that honing in on a key aspect of a student's work can give you the best indicator of how much they've understood in an efficient manner. So take a moment to read what he has to say. For our purposes, it makes sense to consider a generic overview of the student's responses and then hone in on the aspect of your targeted student's responses, which is supported and addressed by the scaffold that you've chosen. If they have achieved in this area successfully, it is likely time to start fading the scaffolds. Although there are detriments to removing scaffolds too early and too late, it's generally better to remove earlier than later, as you can always have the scaffold ready for the student if it turns out you have removed it too soon. With that, let's move on to part 4, focusing on how to remove scaffolds effectively in order to maximize our students' skill, knowledge, and confidence. To begin with, it is important for us to be confident in the difficulty of the work and concepts we are asking students to engage with. We've discussed the curse of knowledge before, and how this can obscure the difficulties that our students face when we ask them to complete a task. In order to make the most effective use of scaffolds and know when to remove them, we need to see past our own knowledge and think about what our students are facing. One way of conceptualizing this is through a concept called the ladder of difficulty. Let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. Pause the video to take a moment to look at the different facets of the ladder of difficulty. This concept considers how to increase the challenge that students face with the work that we're setting them in a variety of different ways. We can see that one of the key ways of doing this is by reducing feedback and scaffolding. But importantly, we must first map out the ladder of difficulty to ensure that we are doing this successfully. Take a moment to read the information on the slide. When we have a strong mental model of the difficulties within a particular area of our subject, we will have a much stronger sense of how and when to use and remove scaffolds. Let's have a look at the other suggestions from the walkthrough as well. Although they're not explicitly linked to the focus of today's session, they can give us an idea of our students' proficiency within a particular area of our subject, and therefore whether they might need scaffolds put in place or removed. Take a moment to read through the information. This concept is similar to spaced practice and can demonstrate whether knowledge or skill has been embedded in your students' long-term memory. Again, pause to read through the information. Being able to identify how to solve a problem in addition to reaching the correct answer is another way of demonstrating expertise. This step highlights the positive impact that reducing scaffolding can have on the level of challenge and therefore on increasing student expertise. Synoptic questions require a greater level of knowledge and expertise because without these, the cognitive load would be too great for a more novice learner. When students are able to handle drawing on knowledge from different topics, it is an indicator that they have gained expertise in this range of topics. Let's now think about how we can effectively fade these scaffolds. The EEF provide a framework for using worked examples, a particular form of scaffolding, which they call the FAME approach. Let's have a look at the steps that they suggest now. So first is fading. Read through this. So an important part of this idea is that you should remove the steps in the solution in reverse order. It's important to think about how this might apply to your particular subject. Next, we have alternating. So this matches closely with the I do, we do, you do approach, which we mentioned earlier. Then we have mistakes. This will enable students to draw on their expertise that they've gained in particular topics, similar to some of the suggestions in the walkthrough. And then finally, explanation. This supports in developing students' metacognition. While each of these can be a useful support for increasing the difficulty of tasks whilst ensuring students are adequately supported, for our purposes, the first step of fading will be most useful. So this is what we'll focus on. Here's a bit more guidance that the EEF give around this step. So pause the video and take a moment to read through. Again, they emphasize the importance of assessment and checking for understanding so that you can feel confident in fading the scaffolds that you've introduced. Here's an example of this fading of worked examples in action, taking from the EEF. You can see that on the right-hand side, several steps from the worked example have been removed. This increases the difficulty for the students whilst maintaining a level of scaffolding. The scaffold is being faded over time rather than being completely removed. Here's another example for science. So key terminology is scaffolded for students by combining a definition with a partially completed spelling. And that can then be faded even further by providing only the initial letters of this key terminology that students then need to label on the actual cells. step of that faded approach might be to remove the line-by-line translation and instead begin with a summary of the scene and some of the key moments. And then finally, as students become more confident and proficient in this area, including only a glossary for unfamiliar words. It's important to remind ourselves that the effects that these scaffolds can have. So let's think about what we read in the article from the Chartered College. Pause the video and remind yourselves. Importantly, Oxo's study suggests that it is very difficult not to use scaffolds if they are available to you. Even those with expertise in reading early modern English still found that they were cross-referencing their own understanding and interpretation of the text against the line-by-line translation. If that had been removed, it would have enabled them to explore their own interpretation more effectively. Finally, to finish off this session, I want you to think about and reflect upon your own use of scaffolds over the course of this year. Can you think of any times when you've consciously faded or removed scaffolds in your lessons? How did you come to that conclusion, and what effect did it have when you did so? Pause the video and write your answer in the booklet. We've now come to the end of the session, so here is the reference list. This is a really important skill to develop, and it's something that I'd like you to continue thinking about, both in terms of the lessons that you still have to teach today, if you still have any left to teach for the ITaP, but also moving forward as well. You'll now have a stretch of time where you will be taking control of the classes that you're teaching. That means that you have the scope now in order to plan long-term and think carefully about where and when you can fade these scaffolds over time. Use the skills that we've developed during this ITaP in order to support you in doing so. Thanks.